Hi, everyone. I am so excited to share this guest with you. We are going to be talking about Gestalt language processing and natural language acquisition. And Alex, you're going to have to correct me if I'm saying this wrong. I actually thought it was Gestalt, and then I started taking your course, and I was like, oh, that's the way to say it. So I'm doing my best here, but
You know what? It's perfect. It is a word that can be said two ways, gestalt or gestalt.
oh, okay, that's good to
Mhm,
know. I'll go with
mhm.
Gestalt then, because that's going to be a lot easier for me to
Okay.
say. Um, so before I have you introduce yourself really quickly, if anyone's not familiar with me, my name is Benita Lipback. I have a passion for AAC, assistive technology and literacy, and I've been able to deliver some poster presentations on AAC at ASHA. I used to be a consultant for a device company and a school district assistive technology specialist here in Florida. And now I am a part-time teletherapist, AAC consultant, and Speech Side Up host, as well as a mom to a little over 1 year old. And I just decided one day, as my New Year's resolution, to start preparing for a sprint triathlon, which is like the easiest type of triathlon. So let's see how this happens by the end of the year.
Awesome. Great goal.
All right.
Okay,
And then, Alex, yeah, let's hear all about you.
sure. So my name is Alexandria Zakos. I do go by Alex. I have been a speech language pathologist for almost 19 years now. I am licensed in the state of Illinois. I have had a variety of experience in all settings, ranging from early intervention to acute care. And I was in the schools for 9 years. I am now in private practice. I own a private practice in the suburbs of Chicago. I found natural language acquisition and Gestalt language processing about 6 years ago. And I'm going to get into that during this interview. But that is kind of my niche now. And I started Meaningful Speech in 2020 to educate SLPs, parents, and professionals about echolalia and Gestalt language processing. And I am also a mom and a wife. My girls are ages 7 and almost 10.
Oh, girls are the best.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit more about your membership. I know this is we're doing an interview here, but it is an amazing membership. So can you just talk about what's included? I know you're reopening it. So if anybody's interested, this is a great time, I think, to hear about it.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. So, what is changing actually is it is no longer a membership. I did launch in April of 2021 as a membership where people were paying monthly, and I was kind of releasing courses every quarter or so, along with other materials. Now that we're relaunching in February, it is going to be sold just as a course. So you will have lifetime access once you pay for it, and any updates I do or anything else I add will be yours. So it is 18 hours might be a little bit more of continuing education. And it is open to SLPs, SLPAs, and parents. And the professionals, the SLPs or the SLPAs that take it are able to take a final exam. And if they pass with over 80% or more, they are able to have the opportunity to be listed in our NLA trained clinician registry, which went live last week. You can find that at meaningfulspeechregistry.com, and parents can go on there and find a provider that understands this in their area. I'm really excited because people have been DMing and emailing me telling me they've already matched up with someone.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's an incredible course. And I've only gotten to the first two modules, but the
Mhm.
handouts have been super helpful, especially in coaching parents. So it's an amazing resource. Thank you for
Thank
that.
you. Thank you.
All right, so we did a little bit of introductions and backgrounds. Then we'll get into a description of Gestalt language processing. We'll go a little bit more in depth. Then we'll talk about the Gestalt language processing characteristics and why SLPs should know about it. And then we'll talk about different treatment strategies and how to write functional goals. And we'll wrap up with a live Q&A. And then Alex, I'll let you share your financial, non-financial disclosures first.
Yeah, so I'm the owner and operator of Meaningful Speech LLC. I'm also being offered a stipend for this podcast episode.
Yeah, and then I have the following relevant financial relationships to disclose. I have ownership interest in Speechy Side Up LLC and Tassel Learning LLC, and I receive royalties from the Lou Knows What to Do book series. And then I am a member of ASHA's Special Interest Group 12. So, our hope by the end of this pod course today is that you'll be able to define Gestalt language processing, identify three characteristics of Gestalt language processing, describe at least two treatment strategies for Gestalt language processors, and finally, identify three reasons why it's important to identify Gestalt language processors. All right, so let's dive in. Let's start with just the basic. What is Gestalt language processing?
Yeah, so I'll start out by saying that the majority of you listening have probably not heard about it unless maybe you found me on Instagram or found Marge Blanc's book. It is actually language development. I think what is a mind blowing to a lot of people when they find out about it is that we were taught in graduate school that there was one way to develop language, and that is analytic language development. And an example of that is kids start out by babbling, and then they say one word, and then they say two words and three, and then they're saying sentences. So I recently posted something showing the difference between Gestalt language processing and analytic language processing. And so I'm going to use milk as an example. So for an analytic processor, they might start out by saying milk, and then mama milk, and then mama more milk. So it's this building up. So as SLPs, we've always thought, okay, that's how a kid develops language. So if we're not hearing that, if we're not hearing those words, then they have a disorder. Then we need to get in there and give them words. So I'm here to tell you that that is not the only way to develop language. Gestalt, the word itself means whole. So kids that develop in the Gestalt language fashion are really looking at language as a whole. So in stage 1 echolalia, they are not processing words as units. They are more focused on intonation. Gestalt processors have been called intonation babies, and they're whole thinkers. So back to the milk example, the first thing that you might hear a Gestalt language processor say regarding milk or requesting a drink or anything, food related might be milk comes from cows. So that might be a script that they picked up from a teacher, a show, a YouTube clip, a movie. Now I'm going to get into how it can look and sound different for different kids that are in stage 1 echolalia. But all gestalts, all scripts are tied to an emotional experience. So they hold meaning for the child. So that milk comes from cows, maybe stuck with the child for some reason. They were feeling some kind of emotion, or it was dramatic. And now that might be their script, for milk. So we can get into that in the next slides, but I think the biggest takeaway that I want everyone to come away with this knowing is that Gestalt language development is language development.
Yeah, that's so important to point that out. Thank you for sharing that. A question that I have, and I'm sure this was talked about in Marge Blanc's Northern Speech Services course and yours as well, but I need a little bit of a refresher. For these babies that are intonation babies or Gestalt language processors, when do you start to see that echolalia appear? Because I am sure a lot of it is dependent on their motor development and the ability to actually produce those phrases.
Yeah, so one hallmark that I think is on a next slide is long strings of unintelligible language. And so a lot of times we identify this as jargon. So an EI therapist might get called in and say, he has no words and all he does is jargon. Well, one of the indicators that the child could be a Gestalt processor is hearing that intonation in their jargon. So they have the rich intonation, but you're not hearing each individual word because they're not picking up on each word. They're picking up on it as a whole. So Like, can you come down for dinner? Might be to them. And they might say that, anytime it's time to eat. So it takes some detective work from us sometimes with these younger Gestalt processors that haven't motorically caught up. But I would say this way of thinking for them can start very young.
Okay. Yeah. So the way that they're processing the language starts very young, but the way that we're perceiving it might be a little bit later than like babbling per se or per
Correct.
se. Got it. Okay. Great. So how do you know a child is a Gestalt language processor?
Yeah, so I hit upon a couple of these a little bit ago, but we're looking for rich intonation, long strings of unintelligible utterances, like I just mentioned, which are often thought of as jargon. The one that is the example that everybody sort of thinks about with echolalia are the scripts or gestalts. From movies or something someone said or a YouTube clip. They can be short or long and they're tied to an emotional experience. And then we also have stuck single words. And what I mean by stuck is those single words are a unit in the Gestalt processor's mind. So they can't be combined with other words in stage one. But the the child isn't doing anything with the single word. It kind of stands alone, and a lot of kids get these stuck single words because oftentimes they're being treated as analytic language processors, and the parent or teacher or speech pathologist is focused on getting them more words, and so they're pushing labeling and things like that. And so these kids have tons of these single words but nothing more. And you can
Gotcha.
see a combination of any of these, Vanita. Like, it can be all of these, it can be one of these, it can be two of these.
Very, very interesting. With the stuck single words, is there still that emotional component tied to it as well, even though like the words are kind of being drilled by a professional or maybe even a parent?
That's a great question. And yes, I have
Okay.
found that to be true. And it won't, words or phrases or, longer gestalts won't stick with the child unless they're emotionally tied in or invested. So I think the more dramatic something is, the more likely it's going to stick.
Okay. That makes sense. And I probably should have asked this on the previous slide, but
Sure.
what is this research like based off of? I know you mentioned Mark Blanc's book. For anybody that's not
Absolutely.
familiar with Gestalt language processing, can we talk a little bit more about the research and like why our programs aren't talking about this very much? And maybe they are more now, but I'd love to hear that reasoning.
Absolutely. So I'll start out by saying there are only 5 or 6, I believe, graduate programs in the United States right now that are teaching this in their curriculum. Like Southeastern Louisiana, Queens, and New York are 2 of them. Um, I personally know and have worked with Dr. Lillian Stiegler, who was teaching this at Southeastern Louisiana, and have had numerous conversations with her about why this isn't being taught in graduate programs. But let me just kind of tell you where this all started from. This research has been around since the 70s. Dr. Ann Peters out of the University of Hawaii has a ton of published research in this area, and she's the one that coined the term Gestalt. And Dr. Barry Present also has a ton of research in this area, but his research is more with autistic individuals. And we know that 75 to 85% of autistic individuals are Gestalt language processors and are more likely to be stuck in those earlier stages, which I'll talk about in a bit. But they are the ones that we often see in therapy that are unable to sort of move to self-generated language on their own. Now, a lot of neurotypical children, which Ann Peters has talked a lot about in her research, are also Gestalt language processors, but they oftentimes will move through the stages on their own. And it happens so fast that a lot of times we don't know they're Gestalt language processors. And Marge Blanc does talk about this in her book, which was published in 2012. The title is Natural Language Acquisition. And the book is based on Prezant and Peter's research, but also Marge Blanc's 20 years of longitudinal research. And that is how she designed the NLA, Natural Language Acquisition Framework, which is, in quotes, the treatment framework for echolalia.
Thank you for giving that background information. You had said that 75 to 80% of autistic children or individuals are Gestalt language processors. That is significant.
It is.
And
I actually think it's
go ahead.
higher, to be honest, but the research is old.
Okay. All right. Very, very fascinating. So since this is really another way to learn language,
Mhm.
when we think about children in early intervention who are delayed expressively, are they truly delayed? Or is it that they are acquiring language differently and it just appears later on?
You're onto something. And this is what Marge talks about in her book. She has an example of, two boys playing in the sandbox. A lot of times we identify boys as late talkers and they end up in EI. I feel like a lot of those kids are Gestalt language processors. And then all of a sudden we start hearing them talk at 3 or 4. Why is that happening? Because they have not motorically caught up to say their long gestalts. And it sounds like they're jargoning at 2.5, 2 years old, when they're actually communicating in gestalts. When they do motorically get caught up, we're hitting upon 3.5, 4 years old. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, they're talking.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's just super interesting. And I feel like we need early markers for this population before even the jargon, because I work in EI. I mean, I work the whole lifespan, but I have kids who have yet to get the autism diagnosis. They're in the process of getting, evaluated, and they don't have language, or they have language. They, will vocalize, they'll gesture, they'll
Mhm.
use facial expressions. We're introducing some AAC, but the traditional approach would be, like you said, to start introducing single words. But if we had some early markers of this might be actually a Gestalt language processor, they are possibly getting a diagnosis of ASD. How should we approach therapy at this early stage? So it's just really fascinating.
Yeah. And I think the cool thing about this is the way that we approach a 16-year-old is almost the same way we should approach a 2-year-old. And I'm going to get into that in a bit. But um, first, we have to build trust and rapport, because a lot of times these kids' language has been ignored and they are almost, told to ignore it or redirect it, especially our older kids. But really, after we build that trust and rapport, it's about modeling scripts that we think they want to say, and they accept that language from us. And then they start, communicating with those scripts. And so just like um, kids need more words if they're analytic processors, Gestalt processors need more scripts at the very beginning when they're in stage 1.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on here before we move on?
No, I think there's a lot to cover with this, but I think we're gonna at least, give people a taste of it.
Yeah, yeah. This is just an overview, but there's
Mhm.
so much more that can be discussed. So, why is it important for SLPs to know about Gestalt language processing? I think we've already kind of touched on it, but let's talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that your listeners are going to realize I'm trying to drive home is that analytic language development, if we approach all kids in that way, we are almost keeping our Gestalt language processors stuck, because those strategies and techniques do not work with them when they are in the early stages of echolalia. I've talked to hundreds of SLPs at this point that now have taken my course or, have learned in other ways, like Marge's book. And they have said to me, Oh my gosh, I spent years being frustrated with these kids, years wondering why they were not moving forward, using all the strategies I had in my toolbox. And they're almost angry that they didn't know about this because, they weren't able to move the needle forward for these kids. So I'm pretty much on a mission right now that every speech pathologist who works in pediatrics, understands this, at least has a surface level understanding of it, and knows that, all those analytic language strategies may not work with every kid that walks into their office. And that's probably why they aren't seeing progress with a lot of kids.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, when I first saw you posting about this and started to like dive into this a little bit more, immediately I had like two evals and I'm like, oh my gosh, I believe both of these are Gestalt language processors. And it's just wild that like if I had not been introduced to this, you know, a month earlier, that like the treatment would have been completely different for
Mhm.
these children. The one thing though, do you find that the process, like if parents don't totally understand Gestalt language processing, how are they typically perceiving therapy? Do they feel like it takes longer than it should, or I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
I totally know what you
Okay.
mean. And I think a lot of it has to do with the parent's knowledge base and what the child's previous therapy was. So I'll just use, my autistic clients as an example. But if they've been through something like ABA or behavioral programming, verbal behavior is completely, excuse me, based on the analytic model. So they're trying to build up words. And so if that's what the parent knows, this is going to feel very strange to them. But my approach to anything and working with anyone and any parent is just to keep educating. So, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, Vanita, but I have so many handouts that my team and I created that can be shared with parents. They're easily digestible. I want this to be accessible to everyone, people that don't even have a language background, like speech pathologists. So I think we just need to work with parents to get them to understand this. And I would say 9 out of 10 parents, in my experience, are so grateful and thankful and immediately say, yeah, this is my kid. What you're describing is my kid. And then I think they go through those stages of grieving in a way too, like, why did we do this? Why were we spinning our wheels? This is why, we haven't made any progress because we've spent 5 years trying to force single words.
Hmm. Yeah, and then one thing you talk about too is that plateau. Like if you do go that approach, then and it is a Gestalt language processor, they end up hitting this plateau because
Absolutely.
yeah, can you explain why that happens?
Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of the word functional. And a lot of times we're pushing, we need to give kids functional language, functional language. I look at that language as survival language. I need help. That's the kind of language I'm talking about. I want chips. I talk a whole ton about why this is not the direction we should be going in with kids, because then we keep them stuck. And these kids are so brilliant and so smart. And if they're in programming that's teaching them single words or survival language phrases, they'll get it. They'll start saying those things. But you know what? They're never going to arrive to flexible, original, self-generated language with that approach. They will continue to stay stuck in that survival language. And I know that's a really bold statement, but it's true. And I know that everyone listening knows kids like this and older kids like this that have not moved past that. And I firmly believe that everyone is capable of flexible original language, which is stage 4 and beyond. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, we can hold kids back as parents and as therapists by pushing certain approaches.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and then just lack of knowledge of what else is available. Thank you for spreading the word. But I think that's really important, the point that you just made, that survival language is not functional language. So can you just, well, we're going to get into goal writing, right? So you're
Mhm.
going to talk about on like the type of scripts that we should
Yeah.
be introducing. Okay,
Mhm.
awesome. I want to talk about the verbal behavior approach just very briefly. Um, I lost my thought for a second. This is what happens when you're going through a leap with a new baby. But I have my big coffee to kind of help out today. I'll skip to my other question that I had, which is, do you ever hear about the relationship between like auditory processing disorder and Gestalt language processing? Because I'll just give you like some background information.
Sure.
There's a specific AAC implementation program out there that talks about how a large percentage of autistic individuals also have auditory processing difficulties, and that it's very difficult for them to break down like big chunks of language. But the fact that, and it kind of sounds kind of silly saying this now, but the fact that the speech generating devices say the words the same way every single time, there's not a range in intonation, that it actually makes it easier for them to parse out the single words from those like longer phrases. Have you ever heard anything
I'm
about that?
gonna tell you the complete opposite.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think auditory processing disorder is largely misunderstood in our field, and that can be a topic for another time. But auditory processing disorder actually needs to be diagnosed by an audiologist. And it is actually, difficulty hearing certain sounds in things. Language processing disorder is more what we should be calling a lot of this. And I think that autistic individuals have been misidentified as having difficulty a lot of times with language processing because people don't understand Gestalt development. And I would say that intonation is going to help an autistic individual more than something sounding robotic.
Mm, that's so interesting.
Mhm.
Thank you for sharing that. It's definitely, it gives you food for thought. And if anybody's familiar with which program I'm talking about, I'm sure the wheels are turning for them as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on here before we move on?
Nope. I think people are probably wanting to hear about some of the other things we keep saying we're going to talk about.
Yeah, let's do it. I know. I feel like we're like getting to the last slide, but it's like the big chunk of what, people are here for. So what treatment strategies are recommended for this population?
Yeah, so Marge Blanc created the natural language acquisition framework. It's published in her book, same title, Natural Language Acquisition. She coined that term because, again, back to what we said a few slides ago, Gestalt development is natural. It is a form of language development. And so she wanted people to know that this is a natural way to get to original flexible language. And like I mentioned, a lot of kids get there on their own. Even autistic kids can get there on their own. I had interviewed Courtney Johnson. She's on Instagram as Just Keep Stimming. She was in one of my lunch and learns, which is available with my course. And she basically told me, I think I got to original flexible language on my own. Like, I don't think that anyone kind of walked me through these stages. And I don't feel like that's unusual. A lot of individuals do get there. The kids that are landing on our caseloads are not getting there on their own. So they are likely stuck in stages 1 or 2. The first stage, there are 4 main stages. There's actually 6, but the last 2 deal with advanced grammar. So I don't always go into them. But the way that the framework works is taking a lot of language samples as part of the assessment and determining which stage the child is mainly communicating in. Most kids are communicating in a mix of stages, but we want to try to figure out their main stage. And that's where we kind of start focusing on how we're going to model certain scripts in our sessions. In stage 1 echolalia, kids are doing exactly what it says. They're echoing in those different ways I talked about earlier. So either that unintelligible language, which we're calling jargon in a lot of cases. We're hearing the shorter, longer scripts. We're hearing stuck single words. This is all happening in stage 1. By stage 2, I call that the mix and match stage or partial mitigations. Kids are taking chunks of that whole gestalt and mixing and matching them. So they're kind of moving them around. So if you look at one, like, Lego building, they're taking a couple pieces down and forming like another Lego building or another unit. And so an example of that is I had a child that used to say all the time, "Don't worry, I'll help you find your mama." And that was from Dora the Explorer. And it meant, "Oh, I'll help you find this game, or we'll find whatever's lost." And one day her mom came in and said, "Oh my goodness, my mother-in-law's visiting, and she said, 'Don't worry, I'll help you find grandma.'" So she was able to like break off a chunk of that gestalt and like mix in grandma, which was from another script that she had. And so that was an indicator to us that she was ready to start mixing and matching. Stage 3 is what I call the magic stage. And this is when kids start processing words as units. So stage 3 is where a lot of our analytic processors start when they start talking, but it's almost like our Gestalt processors have 2 extra stages to go through before they get there. And so stage 3 is exactly what it says here. It's single words and then it's combinations. So adjective plus noun plus noun, and really helping the child pull down words from those partial scripts or those whole gestalts. And then once it's clicked with them, okay, words are units and I'm able to combine words, then we get into stage 4, which is beginning grammar and that self-generated language. So we're hearing things like, "I fall down." Now, how do I know that's self-generated? Bad grammar. I know that's not a script. The child put those 3 words together. I featured a little girl in one of my Instagram videos a couple of weeks ago. Her mom did a big testimonial for me. Her mom was really happy with the course. And in the video we show of her being in stage 4, she says, "I think it be the baby's birthday." And I'm like, yeah, that just screams stage 4, like using that "be" in there and that bad grammar. We know that's not a script that came from anywhere.
Oh, yeah, I remember when I took Marja's course that she said at this stage, a lot of people get a little bit discouraged if they don't understand Gestalt language processing because it seems like the child actually took some steps back when in
Right.
reality they're like, moving right along through the stages.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because a lot of people in stage 1 are hearing that perfect language because the child took the script from someone. So when they do hear, that bad grammar in stage 4, they're freaking out. Like, what happened to the perfect language? But we want that. We want the child to be expressing themselves with their own language. And stages 5 and 6 is when we really start helping them with that more advanced grammar and, getting the right tenses and everything in there.
Okay. I have so many questions. I hope I can articulate all of them. I
I'm
wrote like
sorry.
some notes.
It's a lot of information.
No, it's just so fascinating. So I guess I'll just start with the first one I just wrote. When you are modeling scripts, do you provide visuals as well? And I want to get to like the difference between like introducing sentence strips versus like having a script of a functional
Yeah.
script. So can we talk about the
So
difference?
no sentence strips.
Okay.
We can get into that again some other time, but I do not use visuals. I do not recommend that people use visuals, and I'll tell you why. Because these kids' scripts are tied to an emotional experience. They have a visual already of what that word represents to them, and our visual may not be their visual.
Mm,
So I feel like the best way to explain like why all we would do is model is think about where their scripts originally came from. They came from hearing them. So how are they going to get new scripts? From hearing us. their scripts didn't come from visuals, like the ones they just picked up naturally. I mean, maybe they were watching a show and now it's tied to that experience on the show. But, if they hear mom say, time to put on your shoes, and that's a script for anytime they're leaving the house, there was no like visual attached to that mom flashed in front of them. She just said it.
Mhm.
So in this approach, we are naturally modeling scripts in child-led therapy. We are following the child's lead. We are not printing or laminating anything. We have in mind some scripts that the child needs, and we are naturally infusing them into the session.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. I mean, this is like probably blowing
I know I'm
everyone's
like
minds.
turning everything upside down for a lot of people, but it's good. We all need to
Yeah.
be thinking about all these things that we've been doing for years and if they're really right for kids.
Yeah. And like the one thing I love about your pages and your course is all of these examples, the video examples, the
Yeah,
testimonials, that it's not just
I'm big into
theoretical, like you're putting it
that.
into
Mhm.
practice and you're showing people how it works. Um, Early like language skills that develop even before like expressive language, you know how you've seen the iceberg where it's like under like words and phrases and all of that, you have like joint attention and imitation. Where do those come in with Gestalt language processors?
Those things start happening naturally when you start listening to the child and take a child-led approach. And I have a lot of videos about this too. I just posted one last week about natural eye contact, and I call it the bingo eye contact. I'm not forcing it. I did not write a goal on it, but because the child trusts me and I'm connected with them and I'm listening to them, I'm getting it frequently. And I captured one of my little guys giving me that eye contact, and I made a little reel about it, because in a lot of ways what we've been doing is so backwards. We're doing these adult directed sessions, we're trying to force joint attention, force eye contact, when really like just listening to the child, hearing their spontaneous language, figuring out their special interests and letting them lead the session is naturally going to help those things evolve.
And it makes so much sense because I'm just thinking about my daughter and she's, 14, almost 15 months. And I know that one of the things that people talk about is that, they need to be able to imitate. But I found like early on, like at 5 months, 6 months, that I had to start imitating her. And this wasn't even me, to be honest. This was my husband imitating like
Yeah.
silly things she would do, like little sounds, little like dinosaur sounds. That's when like she kind of opened up to us and
Yeah.
then started imitating. And so, yeah, I see goals for imitation, or I'll see, you know, in verbal behavior that the child needs to be able to imitate. And it's like, wait, we have to imitate them first. And like you said, engage in child led play, and those things will kind of happen naturally. So thank you
Yeah,
for
what
bringing
a
that
great
up.
example with your daughter. Absolutely. And I think a lot of people I've talked to have told me, wow, this feels intuitive, this feels right. But I think unfortunately, with everything that we've been taught over the years and absorbed, we don't listen to our intuition. So
Hmm.
probably your husband, I don't know what his background is, but not having that speech and language background, it probably felt intuitive to him to imitate her.
That's such a good point because he does do such a better job, I feel like, originally at just getting her engaged with us. He would
Mhm.
just do like the silliest things or just like imitate her. And I was like, oh, wow, like she's doing more for you than she like did for me. And now it's
Uh-huh.
like totally different. But yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Yeah,
And I remembered what I wanted to say about the verbal behavior versus modeling.
sure.
And because we were talking about like how parents perceive this approach, because it can seem like it's taking longer because with the verbal behavior approach, for example, and I don't know it very well. So if anybody is very well versed in it, I'm just going to disclose that I'm not super familiar with it. But
Mhm.
I just remember like there was, where you would start with one word and then you get to two and the three, and you're showing parents like, wow, they can make like a 5 word utterance very
Mhm.
quickly, right? And Whereas with modeling, like we're doing a lot of modeling, but there's no guarantee of exactly when the child is going to start imitating those scripts, right?
Correct. Yeah, correct. And I think with a lot of our kids, there's a lot of unlearning based on what they had previously experienced with therapy or at school. And so it takes a lot longer to build that trust that we're actually listening to them and listening to their spontaneous communication. And I've had such a variety. I've worked with a lot of kids in stage 1, and you know, 3, 4, 5 months it took for one child to start, even saying any of the scripts that I had been modeling. But, given his history, I was not surprised. A lot of times there are other things involved as well. Today we did a big post on, I know it's not when this is going to air, but so I'll just say late January did a post on motor speech and scripting or motor planning. So dyspraxia could be in the way for some kids, other sensory integration. And there are other things that play oftentimes for why we're not seeing, things moving. But I think, again, just back to this education piece, I think once the parents understand, okay, this is who my child is, it's not what was taught to me before. So I'm not going to expect the 5-word utterance, because even if I hear it, that's not original language. So isn't our end goal for any of our children that they, have the ability to express novel thoughts and desires and things beyond wants and needs for survival? So, when I frame it like that for parents, it's like, what parent doesn't have that goal for their child? Of course, they want their child to be able to express themselves in that way and not just be reliant on some functional phrases.
Yeah. We're going to talk about goal writing, so maybe we can touch on this when we get there. But what kind of progress are you seeing on those early goals? Like you said, for one child, for instance, that it took like 3 months for him to start, or him or her to start
Yeah.
imitating those scripts.
It's so crazy because I had seen one child that I call pure because he never had any kind of therapy. He was just at home with his parents. And he flew through all the stages and got to stage 4 in 6 months.
Wow.
But then I feel like, unfortunately, with a lot of kids that end up at my clinic, they're coming from elsewhere and have not had very good experiences. A lot of times we're the clinic that they call when they weren't happy elsewhere. And so it's almost like they have to go through this whole period of like unlearning, like the whole tabletop forced adult directed approach. A lot of them are scared to come into therapy, like they have trauma. And so I think taking all those factors into account, things might take a little bit longer. But for these quote unquote pure kids that have not had exposure to a lot of this other stuff, I think once this approach is put in place by the families and the therapist, you start seeing changes immediately.
That's so interesting that you gave the example of the child that like had no previous exposure.
Mhm.
How many of your kids, like I know you said lot of them you'll find scripts from like videos that they've seen. How many are like scripting from nursery rhymes? Do you find that very
Oh, yeah,
often?
that's really common with younger
Okay.
kids. And our Gestalt processors are very musical. I have a series of posts about that as well. So music is like a great way to introduce new scripts to. I'm not
Good.
musical at all, but I have found that a lot of kids like don't care that I can't really sing. I'm imitating them and it's fun for them. And in fact, the video I talked about earlier that I posted last Friday, I'm singing the ABCs and the child's so happy and giving me this great eye contact. And I sound terrible, but again, they don't care.
Mhm. They don't care. Oh, that's a really good example. So, just for instance, if you're doing a nursery rhyme, like, you know how typically we'll like pause, like if we've been modeling the nursery rhyme for a while, we'll typically pause for like a one word. Do we
Mhm.
pause for like the phrase of the
So
nursery
closed phrase strategy, that's for analytic processors.
rhyme?
I
Okay.
do not recommend that for Gestalt processors because, again, what are we trying to get? A single word.
Yeah.
That kind of goes against a lot of what we were talking about. So it's so hard, right, to like undo your brain when you've been thinking about things in that fashion for so long. But it's, I think the best way to think about it is, what is my end goal here? And my end goal is not that they're filling in the blank for me.
Hmm. So we're not like fading that prompting until we start, even like I'm talking about early, until we even get to like that echolalia stage, right?
Well, everyone's in the echolalia stage at the beginning if they're Gestalt processors. And when you start looking at things through that lens, it's like, what does that look like for them? Is it the jargoning? Is it, what are they doing verbally? And if they're completely non-speaking
Hmm.
and nothing's happening verbally at all, then we need to explore more the dyspraxia.
Okay. All right. Super interesting.
Mhm.
Um, one thing I wanted to say too is when we were talking about like the different stages. So when you get to the single words and combinations, personally, like with the two clients that I was working with, I felt like it was really difficult to tell if they were getting to that single words and combinations because of those stuck single words.
Right.
So, yeah, how do you
No.
figure that out?
So I think that it's through a lot of language samples, and I talk about redundancy, not repetition, and that came from Marge Blanc. But we want to try to vary in little ways, like whatever the experience is. So if we're playing with cars, we don't want to play with the cars the same in the same spot in the same way every time. So we're gonna, model the script by the door, and then maybe on the floor, and then maybe with the red cars, and then next time with the trucks. So it's not just attached to like one thing for them. And you can play around with that with those stuck single words. So are they coming up in the same way at the same time all the time? It's likely a stage one script. But if it's stage three, you're going to see a lot more variety there.
Okay. All right. That's a really good distinction. Thank you for that. Okay. Yeah, I'm sure that other people will have questions too, but you covered a lot of what I wrote down.
There's
Is there
so
anything
many. I
else?
mean, I keep mentioning this. There's 18 hours of continuing ed. There's so
Yeah.
much information here. And then I tell people to then go take Marge just released her stage three, or I'm sorry, her level 3 NSS course on Northern speech. That is this massive deep dive. And so it's like there's never ending amounts to learn about this. But I don't
Yeah.
want people to get overwhelmed. I just want them to know this is a real thing, and that if they can just have a surface level understanding of it, that would be great.
Yeah. And then when you see that type of client to start diving in a little bit more. All right. So let's talk about goal writing for this
Mhm.
population.
So the thing that I really am trying to drive home with people is, once you understand the stages, goal writing is so easy. If you understand the main stage the child is communicating in, and again, how are you going to know that? You're going to know that through tons of language samples that you've scored. And I teach you how to do that in the assessment module, module 3. I don't know if you've gone through that one yet, but I have a lot of examples of clients, and we even practice scoring together. And so you're going to have an idea of how to score these language samples. You're going to figure out what stage the child is mainly communicating in, because there might be a few different stages there. And then you're going to write a goal for that. So let's go back to my little guy that I talked about showing a video with. His special interest was letters. He's stage 1. So my goal with him and with our stage 1 kiddos is they need more scripts. Just like analytic language processors need more words, our stage 1 kids need more scripts. And I share some handouts in the course on this. I'm not looking at things through the same lens that behaviorists are, where they're saying, oh, we need to mand and tact or request and comment. I look at different categories that would make sense for kids to have language in. So some of the categories might be sensory motor experiences, transitions, help, having fun with someone, surprises. So we look at all those categories and we try to figure out, do they have scripts in these categories? And if not, that's going to be one thing we're going to model, picking scripts in those categories. The other huge piece is the detective work. The scripts that they have and what they're saying now, where did they come from? What do they mean for them? So, don't worry, I'll help you find your mama. I might be modeling in that case. We're going to find it because that's really what she's telling me. And that is a great script for her to have because it's easily mitigable. And what does that mean? Those words can get mixed and matched when they're in stage 2. Certain scripts are not very easy to mitigate. And so, like to infinity and beyond, what are you going to mix and match there? And does that even have a place in our everyday conversation? So we want kids to have scripts that they can easily mitigate when they get to stage 2. And so kind of using those guidelines, thinking about the categories and then thinking about what they truly want to say. And it might take some trial and error with that. We don't always know what scripts mean. I talk about, parents a lot being the experts. And if we can, looking toward parents and asking them, what do you think this script means? Where do you think this came from? And so a combination of those things are going to help us come up with, let's say, 3, 4, 5 scripts we're going to model in a child-led session. And there's our goal, 3 to 5 new gestalts. And so why are people finding goal writing difficult? Because they don't understand the stages. They don't understand all of this. But if you go through the whole course, I promise you're going to come away totally understanding how to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. This is just super helpful. So, where do social skills come into play with this? Are you writing
Yeah.
goals for those as well?
So I'm not writing any goals for anything like that until kids are self-generating,
Okay.
because my ultimate goal is that we're to the point where they have their own language. And like we talked about earlier, all that social stuff is naturally evolving in a child-led session anyway.
Mhm.
So that is happening as we're hitting on these other things.
Mhm. Totally makes sense. Oh my gosh, Alex, this has been incredible. I wanted to just do you have anything else that you want to share about this before I tell a little story?
No, I just wanted to say, I know I keep sending people back to my course, but I want to tell you all there are a lot of really good resources out there. And I have a huge list on my website for free that you can download. A lot of webinars on YouTube that Marge has done that are free. There are so many ways right now for you to learn this. So hop on meaningfulspeech.com and grab that free PDF of resources.
Awesome. Well, here's your list of references, and there's so many more. I know the handout includes more as well, but if anybody wants to take a screenshot of this, if they're just dying to dive in right now, go ahead and do that. If not, it will be available in the handout or on the platform. And where can everybody find and connect with you? Is Instagram the best place? I know you had
It
mentioned your
is.
website as well.
Yes, Instagram is the best place. I'm very active on there. I do have a Facebook page. I will fully admit I do not do a lot with it except maybe share what I post on Instagram. I'm just not on there at all. Marge Blanc does have a Facebook group called the NLA Study Group. It is really for people that have more than a basic understanding of this and kind of want to talk about topics a little bit more in depth. My Instagram is really for anyone that wants to learn about this from beginning to advanced. You can find my course and a lot more info about all of this at meaningfulspeech.com. And then I also have a registry of people who have taken the course and passed the final exam that are listed as providers for parents to connect with, and it's worldwide, and that you can find that at meaningfulspeechregistry.com. And if you are an SLP or an SLPA and you're interested in learning about this and you want to take on some clients in this area, you can definitely take the course and the exam, and then have the opportunity to be listed on the registry.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll open it up to the Q&A now, but this was just phenomenal. I so appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Great. Alex, are you there?
I am. It's not letting me turn on my video. It says host has disabled.
All right. No worries. If we can get it working, we will, but we're so appreciative that you're here. Oh, I guess you're a co-host now, so you should be able to turn on your video. Give it another try.
All right, let me see here.
Okay.
Here
we go.
Okay,
Yay.
There I am. Hi, everybody.
Yay.
I'm in the car. I apologize. Lots of sun. And I also cannot see the questions in the chat right now. So I don't know how many there are, but if you want to read some of them to me, I can try to answer some.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll start with the first one that came through. We have quite a few questions. So the first one says, what might beginning NLA therapy look like a session, breakdown, focus when starting to build that connection? For example, feeling empowered and more listening and silence before running straight into rashly modeling Gestalt.
Sure. Yeah. So I think a lot of it has to do with the child's age and what their past therapies look like. So with a lot of our older children, it's going to take a lot longer for us to build that rapport and trust, to have them feel like their gestalts are being heard and acknowledged. And then, a lot of them have had compliance-based therapy or something like that, or have been treated like analytic language processors. So they're used to adults directing the session. So sometimes that can just take longer. And my biggest piece of advice is to just allow for spontaneous language to emerge so we can hear their scripts and hear their gestalts. The best way to do that is through child-led. So finding out what their interests are and making sure that your session is set up so that you're following their lead. That's also my advice with our younger kids. I have a lot of info on this in both my course and my Instagram. Sorry, like I said, there's a lot of sun. But basically, what we want to make sure that we do is not follow those structured plans that a lot of us have been taught as speech pathologists. We want to make sure that we have toys out or activities out that we've already talked to the parent about, that we know that the child is interested in. And so after we've established all of that, we want to gather tons and tons of language samples so we can find out what stage the child is mainly communicating in. And then from there, we will know, okay, what do we want to focus on? Are we modeling new gestalts? Are they in stage 1? Are we mitigating gestalts for them in stage 2? All of setting up all of that beforehand and establishing that relationship with them is going to help us work on those things.
Awesome. The next question says, will Gestalt language learners, let me rephrase this. Will Gestalt language learners learn motoric patterns such as shoe tying, folding laundry, brushing teeth as a whole piece? I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, so I was just recently talking about this on social media, that our Gestalt processors are whole to part thinkers, and we see this a lot in literacy. And so funny, we should bring up these other areas because a lot of parents have recently been talking in the groups about how they're seeing this with things like puzzles and things like, learning new skills. I like that someone brought up shoe tying. So yes, they are approaching almost their whole life in this way. Rachel Dorsey recorded a really great bonus module for me in my course. She's an autistic SLP, and she calls this Gestalt cognitive thinking. So this is like their whole to part thinking that they have going on, not just in language.
So interesting. And I feel like that has something to say about like discrete task analysis. I don't remember if I'm saying the term correctly, but that
Discrete
almost,
trial. Mm-hmm.
okay, yeah. That I feel like that almost goes along with like analytic language learning. But yeah, it's super fascinating. Another question that came through said, is there any way to get some examples of scripts that you may naturally infuse?
Yeah, so a lot of people ask me about this all the time, and I just want to emphasize that this is a very individualistic approach. So I won't give out scripts that I will tell people they should model. Really, what it comes down to is figuring out, like I call it the detective work, figuring out what the child's current scripts mean and what they're trying to say. And then from there, you can come up with what new scripts you want to model. Now, for our really young kids that sound unintelligible and have that, or to have the gestalts that we can't understand at all, but we know they're gestalts because they're intonationally defined. We know they got them from somewhere, or from a movie or show. For those kids, I do often start with looking at like different categories of communication, things like help, surprise, transition, and then I think, okay, well, what gestalt that's easily mitigable can I model right now for them, and see if they accept it, see if that's helpful to them, see if that's something that they are then going to take on as a gestalt. But I like people to look at like our different categories of communication. I guess other people would call them like different functions. I don't always like that word, but we want to kind of look and see what are they missing, and then think about mitigable gestalts that we can model there.
And I think there's some main words that you like to start some of the gestalts with, right? Could you just share
Mhm.
like those words really quick?
Yeah, so I just want to, I guess, emphasize that carrier phrases have no place in this type of therapy. So when I talk about those words, I'm not saying use them as carrier phrases. So I mentioned certain words like it's, I'm, that, because those words are easily mitigable, meaning when the child is ready to break down the gestalt, it's a lot easier to break down, let's go to the gym, and move it around and say, let's go home now, than it is to break down something like to infinity and beyond. That's not mitigable. I can't break that down. What am I going to say, to school and beyond? Like that wouldn't work for the child. So we're starting out and using words that we know can be easily moved, easily mitigated in stage 2.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Another question says, do Gestalt language learners get mixed up with childhood apraxia of speech learners? Sorry, that's a messy question, but do you understand what I'm asking?
I totally do. I've talked a lot about some of our young kids not being motorically caught up. And what that means is that they are saying long gestalts that are unintelligible. So we've got these little kids, 2.5, 3 years old, trying to say like a 10-word gestalt that they got from somewhere. And so we don't understand what it is. And the reason we don't is because a 2.5-year-old typically is not going to be saying a 10-word gestalt. So a lot of people, especially in the early intervention world, start to think that maybe these kids have apraxia because they're unintelligible and they don't have any quote unquote real words. But I'm trying to help people kind of look at it in a different way and say, actually, they might be gestalt processors. Are those unintelligible strings intonationally defined? Are we seeing some of these other characteristics?
Okay, awesome. And then another question said, being from the 70s, this information was emerging and resonated with me, but I think our programs have moved away. Thank you for bringing this information to the forefront as your course go into assessment.
Yes, I have an entire module on assessment, module 3, and it's actually one of my favorite modules because I show a ton of client videos. So you are able to kind of watch me talk through assessment. And with Marge Blanc's blessing, I have a lot of information from her book, Natural Language Acquisition, on scoring and specifically how to score language samples. But then the part that I feel is unique that I really love is I show client videos and have you practice scoring. So I give you some background. We look at language samples. This is all obviously pre-recorded and self-paced. So you would watch me, watch the video, pause it, do your scoring, and then come back and we would kind of discuss it together.
Awesome. Another question says, can you please provide some examples of what strategies to use? This is a pretty broad question, so I don't know how much you want to go into it.
I feel like we kind of got into that in the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So the framework that's used in this approach is called natural language acquisition. It's what my mentor, Marge Blanc, wrote her book on, based on the stages established by Dr. Barry Present in 1983. But I guess I wouldn't call it strategies. We follow this framework. We know that our Gestalt processors are picking up these scripts auditorily. So what we're trying to do is focus on that, and we're modeling new scripts for them or helping them break down their scripts through our own language.
All right. And then another question says, when introducing new scripts, do you always model from the client's perspective or the child's perspective? What about pronouns?
Okay, pronouns come up very, very frequently. So what I can say about pronouns is that the child in the early stages 1 and 2, they are using the language of the original speaker. So if I said to a kid, go put on your shoes, and next time it was time to go out, they might say, go put on your shoes. And people look at that as a pronoun reversal or a pronoun error, but it actually has nothing to do with pronouns. They're taking that whole script that they heard me say, and they're using it in context the next time we need to go out and put shoes on. Pronouns start to quote unquote correct themselves when the child is in stage 4, which is when they're self-generating language. So then we kind of start to actually target pronouns and work on them. It doesn't make sense to work on them when a child is in the earlier stages because, first of all, words like pronouns aren't being processed as units until stage 3. And then the other piece is they're just taking what the original speaker says. So it's not really an issue of pronoun reversal.
Thanks for sharing that. Okay, the last question is, this focuses a lot on the expressive language piece. How do we target the receptive language piece?
Yes, so this also comes up quite frequently as well. So what I teach is we want to presume competence. Unfortunately, most of our evaluations and standardized tests are really tapping into that expressive language when we're trying to look at receptive. And so we're giving these kids really low scores because we're asking WH questions, and a kid that scripts isn't going to give you an accurate answer until they're in stage 4 and they're self-generating. So really, when I get a kid to the point where they're self-generating, that's when I can actually see where their receptive language is actually at. Also keeping in mind that they're whole to part thinkers. So when you're doing even things like multi-step directions and stuff like that, you need to keep in mind when you switch little things with those directions, that doesn't always fit into their whole, if that makes sense. So we're not truly actually looking at their receptive language, and nor can we really know where they're at receptively until they are self-generating. So again, presume competence. We say that with AAC all the time. Yeah, and we need to do that with these kids as well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Alex, this has been amazing. We got through all of the questions. If anybody has, thank you so much. If anybody has new questions, you can definitely drop them in the Facebook group and we'll present them to Alex and try to get a response at least by the end of the challenge. Thank you so much for joining us live today. And
thank
it
you.
looks like
Thank
Kelly's
you for
super
having
excited.
me.
I think she joined your course. So Kelly's going to be,
welcome.
yeah. And I'm excited to finish it too. Thanks again, Alex. All right, everybody. I can't believe we did it. Woohoo! We finished the day. Alex, you're
Thank
welcome to go
you.
if you'd like. Thanks
Okay,
again for
thank you.
coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. This episode is part of a digital conference event called SLP Live. As a reminder, listening to this podcast episode does not automatically guarantee ASHA CEUs. If you want to earn up to 0.6 ASHA CEUs for this episode, please register for the conference SLP Live using the link in the show notes. There is a small $35 ASHA processing fee to earn up to 0.6 ASHA CEUs. There's also an all-access pass that gets you access to the digital exhibit hall with discounts and perks, a private Facebook group, and a 3-month subscription to Tassel Learning and the SLP Nerdcast Superfan subscription. To earn ASHA CEUs, first register for the conference with the link in the show notes or go to www.slp-live.com. Then you'll be able to access the course evaluation, quiz, and earn your certificate. Please submit all required materials no later than April 19th, 2022. SLP Live would like to thank all of the corporate sponsors for donating products, services, and/or discounts as giveaway prizes to attendees at no charge. You can see a list of these sponsors and enter to win on the SLP Live website.